Modern software companies do something that would have sounded completely insane 30 years ago. They build products before fully knowing what they're building. Investors fund platforms before requirements are clear, teams release unfinished features to users, and billion-dollar companies make decisions through experimentation instead of long-term prediction. This shift completely changed how software is developed, and it's one of the main reasons Agile took over the industry. But the story is much bigger than Scrum boards and stand-ups, because what really changed was the world around software itself. So why did nearly the entire software industry move away from long-term planning and toward Agile? And did Agile actually solve the problem, or just create a new one? Let's talk about it. For a long time, technology moved slowly, products shipped in long cycles, updates were rare, and once systems were released, they often stayed mostly unchanged for years. In that world, planning everything upfront actually made a lot of sense. This became known as the Waterfall model. The idea was to define all the requirements, then design the system, then build it, then test it, and finally release it. One phase finishes before the next begins. Clean, structured, predictable. And for the world at the time, it was a rational approach. Industries like construction, aerospace, and manufacturing already operated this way. You don't build half a bridge, ask people how they feel about it, and then redesign it in the middle. You plan it carefully, you calculate everything, and then you execute. Early software development borrowed heavily from this mindset, because back then software behaved more like traditional engineering than modern product development. There were also practical reasons for this. Hardware releases were expensive, deployments were risky, and updating system was nothing like it is today. You couldn't just press a button and instantly release changes to millions of users. Every release carried real cost. Testing was slower, infrastructure was limited. Automation barely existed. So naturally, companies wanted to reduce uncertainty as much as possible before building anything. Because once development started, changing direction became slow and expensive. And underneath all of this was one very important assumption, that you can fully understand the problem before building the solution. And for a while, that assumption mostly worked. Requirements changed slowly, markets were more stable, users were relatively predictable, so companies optimized for predictability. But slowly, the cracks started to appear. Technology kept moving faster. Products became more connected, markets became global, and user expectations started changing constantly. Software stopped being something you release once. It became something that continuously evolves. And that created a problem for the waterfall model. Because the further you move into a project, the more expensive change becomes. If you discover something important late in development, you often have to go backwards, redesign, rebuild, retest. And in many projects, teams spend months, sometimes years, building something before realizing users didn't actually want parts of it. On paper, everything looked fine, until suddenly it wasn't. And the bigger the project became, the harder it was to recover. So even though Waterfall looked structured, it often produced something very different in reality. Slower feedback, late discoveries, expensive mistakes. And as the world around technology kept accelerating, this model started feeling less like control and more like resistance to change. So different ideas started to emerge. What if you stopped trying to predict everything up front? What if you built in smaller steps and adjusted as you learned? That question eventually became the foundation of Agile. But before Agile could truly take over, something much bigger had to change first: the world itself. At a certain point, the problem wasn't just how we build software, it was how fast the world around software started to move. The first big shift was the internet. Before that, software was mostly distributed in slow cycles. You bought a product, installed it, maybe waited for a year or more for an update, but the internet changed the game completely. Suddenly, software could be updated instantly. No physical distribution, no waiting for release cycles, no long delays between idea and delivery. And that alone changed expectations. Users stopped thinking in terms of version and started expecting continuous improvement. If something didn't work well, they didn't wait for the next release, they just left. The second shift was competition. Software stopped being local or regional, it became global. A startup in one country wasn't just competing with nearby companies anymore. It was competing with the best product anywhere in the world. And in a global market, speed becomes a major advantage, because if two companies are solving the same problem, the one that learns faster usually wins. Then there is another important shift. Software stopped being just a supporting tool for business. It became the business itself. Think about companies like Amazon, Netflix, Google. In those companies, software isn't a department, it is the product. And that breaks the rules. When software is directly tied to revenue, delays are no longer just technical issues, they become business risks. A slow release can mean losing customers, a wrong assumption can mean losing entire market. Even traditional industries started shifting in the same direction. Banks are a good example. What used to be purely financial institutions are now essentially fintech companies with banking licenses. Most of what you interact with, payments, transfers, budgeting tools, fraud detection, is software. And customers now judge banks not just by trust or physical presence, but by how good their apps are. In some cases, people never even visit a branch anymore. That means banks are now competing on UI, delivery performance and digital features, the same dimensions as tech companies. And that pushes them towards the same development pressure. Release, adapt, and learn faster. And then there is one more subtle but important change. We stop being able to fully predict user needs upfront. In earlier systems, requirements were often written as if they were fixed. But in reality, users only discover what they need when they actually start using a product. This is something every team eventually learns. What users say they want and what they actually use are often very different things. And this is where traditional planning started to struggle, because it assumes that the best way to build something is to understand it completely before you start. But in a fast-moving, uncertain environment, that becomes a limitation. And once companies accepted that uncertainty was unavoidable, another question naturally emerged. If we can't predict everything upfront, how do we avoid wasting time building the wrong thing? Interestingly, the answer didn't come from software, it came from manufacturing. Decades earlier, Toyota had faced a similar challenge. They realized that producing too much too early or holding onto inventory you don't immediately need isn't just inefficient, it's waste. And software companies eventually realized they had their own version of the same problem. Spending months designing, building and testing a massive feature before knowing whether user actually wanted wasn't just risky, it was waste. So many of the ideas behind lean manufacturing started finding their way into software development. Build smaller batches, get feedback earlier, reduce unnecessary work, learn before you scale. In other words, stop optimizing for prediction and start optimizing for learning. This shift didn't start as a formal methodology, it started as survival. Teams needed faster feedback loops, faster delivery and faster learning. And over time, these ideas began to converge into what we now call Agile. But the interesting part is that Agile didn't become dominant because it was designed in a perfectly academic way. It became dominant because it matched how modern software actually behaves in the real world. And a few companies push these ideas further than anyone else, not by writing frameworks, but by changing how they build products at scale. If you look at companies like Amazon, Netflix, and Google, you start to see the same pattern repeating. Small teams, fast iterations, continuous delivery, constant experimentation. As these pressures increased, some companies didn't just adopt Agile. They started redefining how software development should work entirely. And interestingly, many of the ideas that later became Agile best practices didn't come from Agile frameworks themselves. They came directly from tech companies building their products at scale. Amazon is one of the clearest examples of this shift. Instead of organizing teams around large centralized projects, Amazon moved towards small independent teams. The idea was to make each team own a product or service end-to-end, without waiting for approval from multiple layers, without being dependent on other teams to ship. They could build, test, and release independently. This is often described through the two-pizza team idea, teams small enough to be fed with 2 pizzas. But the real idea behind it is not size, it's autonomy. When teams are independent, they can move faster, make decisions faster, and learn faster. And that directly supports one of the core ideas behind Agile, reducing delays between decision and feedback. Netflix pushed a different dimension of the same idea. For Netflix, the product is constantly evolving. There is no final version of Netflix. Everything is continuously improved. Recommendations, UI, playback, content discovery. To support this, Netflix built a culture around continuous delivery and experimentation. Features are released gradually, tested with real users, and measured through data. If something works, it expands. If it doesn't, it gets rolled back quickly. This creates a system where mistakes aren't catastrophic, they are expected, and that makes it safe to move faster. But Netflix also went one step further than most companies. They didn't just assume systems would work correctly in production. They assumed they would fail, and they built for that. This is where concepts like chaos engineering come in. Instead of trying to prevent every possible failure in advance, they intentionally introduce failures into their systems. For example, disabling services or simulating outages, to see how the system behaves under stress. The goal isn't to avoid failure completely, but to make the system resilient enough that failures don't bring everything down. So when something does break in real life, it's already been experienced in controlled conditions. And again, the underlying idea is the same. You cannot predict every scenario up front, but you could build systems that adapt and recover quickly. Google took a similar approach, but focused heavily on experimentation. A large part of product development at Google is driven by A/B testing. Instead of debating ideas for long periods, they test them with real users. Different versions of a feature are shown to different groups, and decisions are made based on actual behavior data. This reduces reliance on assumptions, and again, it reinforces the same principle. You don't fully know what works until users interact with it. So you build systems that allow learning in real time. If you step back, all these companies look different on the surface, but they share the same underlying principles. They all try to reduce the time between building something, learning from it, and improving it. Because in fast-moving environments, that cycle becomes a real competitive advantage. Not perfect planning, not detailed documentation, but learning speed. And this is where Agile stops being a methodology and starts being something else entirely, a response to uncertainty, a system for continuous learning. But once this approach spread beyond these companies, it started breaking in unexpected ways. It stopped being a mindset and started becoming a process. Stand-ups, backlogs, sprint plannings, retrospectives. All of these things are useful on their own. But in many companies they slowly turned into a checklist. Once it happens, something important gets lost. Because Agile was never really about ceremonies. It was about reducing uncertainty through fast feedback. But in practice, many organizations started doing Agile without changing how they actually make decisions. So teams began to look Agile on the surface while still operating in a very traditional way underneath. This is often called Agile Theater. Everything looks right in meetings and dashboards, but the core problems still exist. Work is heavily predefined up front, teams still wait for approvals, changes are still expensive, and delivery still happens in large batches, just split into artificial iterations. In some cases, Agile even added overhead. Instead of reducing bureaucracy, it created new layers of it. More meetings, more coordination, more reporting. Another common issue appears when Agile scales in large organizations. Companies try to coordinate dozens or even hundreds of teams using strict frameworks. One of the most well-known examples is SAFe, Scaled Agile Framework. The intention is understandable. When you have many teams, you need alignment, but the side effect is often increased structure, increased dependencies, and slower decision-making. Which is almost the opposite of what Agile was trying to solve in the first place, because the original idea was small teams, fast decisions, fast feedback. But at scale, organizations often rebuild hierarchies through process instead of structure. There is also another subtle problem. In many companies, Agile becomes a delivery mechanism rather than a learning system. Teams focus on did we complete the sprint instead of did we learn something useful and improve the product. And when output becomes more important than learning, teams optimize for completion rather than discovery. And that leads to predictable cycles of work that don't necessarily move the product forward. Now, none of this means Agile itself is flawed. It means the implementation often drifts away from its original idea. Because Agile works best when it's supported by fast decision-making, real autonomy, short feedback loops, and trust in teams. Without all those foundations, it slowly turns into a structured version of Waterfall, just with shorter timelines. And that's why so many people experience Agile differently. Some teams feel empowered and fast, others feel slowed down by process and coordination. The difference is rarely the framework itself, it is the environment around it. And that brings us to the final question. If Agile was a response to change, and if it works so well in many contexts, what does it actually mean for companies today? If you strip away all the terminology, frameworks, and ceremonies, Agile becomes much simpler. At its core, it's a response to uncertainty. It accepts the reality that many modern companies have learned the hard way. You don't fully understand what you're building at the beginning, you discover it as you go. And that's exactly what happened over the last few decades. Software became easier to build, easier to distribute, and easier to fund. Companies started investing in digital transformation, automation, cloud platforms, and more recently AI, often before there was a fully defined solution. The direction was clear, but the destination wasn't. Ideas evolved while products were being built. And in that environment, waiting for complete certainty stopped being practical. From my own experience, especially on startup projects, some products simply couldn't have been planned in detail from day one. The requirements emerged through experimentation, customer feedback, and continuous learning. The product was discovered during development. And that's really the deeper reason Agile became so popular. Not because companies wanted stand-up story points or sprint plannings, but because modern software stopped being something you can fully define before you build it. So when you zoom out, the story isn't really Agile versus Waterfall, but more like prediction versus adaptation. One tries to eliminate all uncertainties up front, the other accepts uncertainty and learns through it. And as technology, markets, and customer expectations continue to change faster than ever, that second approach keeps becoming more relevant. Not because it's perfect, but because it fits reality a little better.